In the 70s and 80s, thousands of NHS patients were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products. I'm sure you're all aware of that and of it having happened in our lifetime. It was in some ways it was a public health tragedy. It devastated lives, caused immense suffering. It exposed serious failures in the blood product screening and policies. And there's been a decade-long fight by victims and families for acknowledgement and compensation. Actually, the inquiry is still going on and its report is due this May. So it's kind of watch this space. But it was very much known as a royal disease. And the most famous one, of course, was Queen Victoria. And it's a lifelong condition, haemophilia, and it's primarily affects males due to the X-linked genetic inheritance pattern, which you can see here. So the ones that are outlined in red are the women who were transmitters, who were carriers of haemophilia, and the ones with blue were the men who actually became haemophiliacs, as they were known. So the fact is that people with haemophilia blood bleed for longer periods as it can't form proper clots. And it bleeds into can bleed into your joints and muscles, and it can from internal injuries. So it is managed by injections of clotting factor to allow proper clotting. And without it, it can be permanent damage and life-threatening. When you give your blood in the NHS, it's a gift. All you expect is a cup of tea. Or if you can remember the Tony Hancock one of the blood donor, which I think is one of the most hilarious Hancock's half hours that there ever was. He was a bit shocked with the amount of blood it was said. He said, that's a whole armful you're taking. Whereas in America, people are paid to give blood, and that made a very, very big difference. So it carries much greater risk of contamination. The factor VIII concentrate was licensed for use in Britain in 1973, where much of it was imported from America because we couldn't make enough of it here. So that's factor VIII. They do it with the Roman numerals, factor VIII, and there's also a factor IX as well. There's the two types. The first treatments for it became available in the early 60s, called cryoprecipitate, or cryo as it was known. It had to be very carefully thawed, administered by a drip in hospital, meant hours of painful treatment and a week's hospital stay to recover. So it was, whilst it worked, it wasn't as practical as factor VIII, which was developed later in the 60s, where the production involved pooling batches of donated blood, fractioning it, freeze-dried, packed into bottles, and then haemophiliacs could get it out of the fridge themselves, mix it and inject it to stop bleeds. In 1962, the median life expectancy for severe haemophiliacs in Britain was age 37. By 1980, it was practically normal. So it was a good thing, without doubt, that it was developed. It's estimated round about 2,400 people have died after being infected with HIV and hepatitis C, which was just as serious, given the kidney damage it led to, through the contaminated blood given by the NHS in the 80s and 90s. That's 2,400 people died unnecessarily. Poor Americans queuing to sell their blood on Skid Row in Los Angeles, including alcoholics and drug addicts, which highlighted the risk of catching hepatitis B from the factor concentrates produced. And several of British doctors said it shouldn't be imported from the United States. A few years later, after they started doing that, there was an outbreak of hepatitis amongst the haemophiliac pupils at Trelaws. For example, Gary Webster was there when 17 when he was told, and he might have just 2 or 3 years to live. It was early 1983, and he was at the boarding school with many of the others, and nearly all of the ones who were there and who went to that school subsequently died over the next few years. In the Labour government in the 1970s, he was the Minister of State for Health, and of course he was a doctor. It was Dr. David Owen, it's now Lord David Owen, and he was faced with the evidence of the dangers of US blood products. He'd seen the Granada reports thing, and he told the House of Commons he was funding an effort to make Britain self-sufficient within 2 years by 1977. However, He was moved from the Department of Health, and somehow the government dropped the commitment without actually having ever said that. Much of the paperwork was subsequently and mysteriously pulped. And the idea that there's been a government cover-up has been with us ever since. So we've now got the infected blood inquiry chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff, and it was set up in 2017 by Theresa May and began proceedings in 2018. It heard oral evidence from more than 200 people with many thousands of pages of documents and written submissions, both from family members as well as victims. And this is a statement made by Lord Alf Morris in 2001. Almost everyone with haemophilia now over 15 was infected by HIV and HCV by unclean NHS blood and blood products. And of a haemophilia community of some 6,000, now approaching 1,000 have died of one or other of these two life-threatening viruses. Others are now in very poor health, many of them terminally ill, and have lost their jobs, homes, and in some cases families due to infection.
So many have already died. Among those still living with serious illness, what sustains their sense of burning injustice are their suspicions about the government's handling of this scandal. On behalf of the victims, today the man leading the inquiry promised to uncover anything there is to be found. It was in the late 60s that a new blood-clotting agent called Factor VIII revolutionised the lives of people with haemophilia, a simple injection helping protect them from bleeding to death from a cut or a bruise. The UK hadn't the capacity to keep up with the demand for Factor VIII, so in 1972, with the government's approval, the NHS began importing it from the USA. But the firms making those supplies were buying the blood from prisoners, sex workers and drug addicts, groups at high risk of carrying infectious disease. As early as 1975, the government received clear warnings there was a risk of people catching hepatitis. By 1983, the risk of contracting the newly discovered AIDS virus was also known, and finally action began to be taken to make supplies safer. But it wasn't until 1990 that the government started notifying victims, and every government since has refused a public inquiry until last year Theresa May ordered this one.
There was a major cover-up, in my view. People's medical records amended, people treated without their consent, people with a positive diagnosis not told for years, and all of the knock-on effects that could have. So major wrongs were done here, and I hope this inquiry will finally give people the truth and also a degree of justice.
Yeah. I've probably told you this before, but many years ago I went to Weight Watchers because I'd put a bit of weight on, and they always had a magazine that was lying around the place. And there was this one with a big headline, you know, that this marvelous woman that had lost loads of weight and she'd only got one leg. It was like, unbelievable.
That's a bit drastic, isn't it?
It was true. Whoever, you know, obviously it wasn't very well edited, that